right, let's just dive right into this. When we talk about global influence, it's so incredibly tempting to just look at two massive figures on the world stage, like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and ask, okay, who actually holds more sway? But as we're going to see in this explainer, the answer is way more complex than just comparing two guys in suits. What we're really looking at are two completely different architectures of global power. So today, we're unpacking exactly how these distinct forms of influence are wielded across the globe, specifically detailing how U.S. financial, media, and soft power networks create a truly unique global reach.
To really grasp this reach, we've got to look well beyond traditional armies. We're going to start by looking beyond raw military might. Then we'll get into the global financial grip, dominating information and tech, the soft power machine, and finally, we'll weigh structural power versus absolute domestic control.
So, Part 1. Beyond raw military might and the limitations of firepower.
Now, historically speaking, and political scientist John Mearsheimer actually theorized this, global powers always relied on secure geography, massive economies, and cutting-edge military tech. And hey, by those metrics, the U.S. has it all. Just look at the Department of Defense's 2025 budget. It is a staggering $832 billion. That's more than the next 10 countries combined. They're pouring all that into next-generation drones, cyber warfare, AI, the whole shebang. Russia, by comparison, officially spends around $145 billion. So on paper, the U.S. military is completely unmatched. But history, especially in places like Vietnam or Afghanistan, repeatedly shows us that an incredibly expensive army and raw firepower don't always equal an automatic victory. Which brings us to a really crucial question. If a massive defense budget doesn't guarantee absolute global control, what happens when firepower just isn't enough? Well, the reality is that true, modern global dominance isn't really fought on physical battlefields anymore. The real battles, they're fought in the realms of finance, resources, and information.
Moving right along to Part 2, the global financial grip and weaponizing the dollar.
So here's the thing. The US dollar isn't just American currency. It is the world's reserve currency. And that creates this unparalleled, almost invisible web of power wrapped around the entire globe. Just look at the basic infrastructure of international finance. Nearly every major transaction clears through systems tied to American banks and regulators. Take SWIFT, for example. Now, it's technically based in Belgium, but it operates under heavy US and allied influence. Analysts use a brilliant metaphor for this. Cutting off a nation's access to SWIFT, which is exactly what happened to Russian banks, is literally like shutting off a country's oxygen supply. Now, sure, China and Russia have tried to build alternatives like CIPS and the SFMT, but let's be real. Right now, they're absolute minnows swimming next to the established Western system. So the absolute most crucial point here is the power of the pen. With a single stroke, an American president can instantly freeze adversary assets, absolutely cut entire corporations out of global markets, and leave adversary states scrambling just to pay their basic bills. Now, Putin? Yeah, he can temporarily shake global markets by holding back energy exports, like oil and natural gas. But those fluctuate based on demand, right? U.S. control of global finance, on the other hand, is a permanent structural advantage. It is baked right into the foundation of the global economy. Basically, Washington sets the rules of the board game. All right, Part 3, dominating information and tech, or controlling the narrative. If finance is the hidden architecture of power, well, information is the glowing storefront. Just think about Apple, Google, Meta, and X. These aren't just big corporations. They are the absolute backbone of global communication and commerce. Then add in massive newswires like Reuters and the Associated Press, feeding info to thousands of outlets worldwide. Russia definitely has equivalents, Yandex, Vkontakte, RT, but they matter almost exclusively at home. They completely lack that ubiquitous, borderless reach that Silicon Valley and Western media networks have built up. And what this means in practice is actually profound for the news you and I read every single day. In a global conflict, simply by virtue of being the American president, a leader sits atop this massive media machine that inherently frames the narrative everywhere, from Nairobi to New Delhi. The whole ecosystem is practically primed to frame the U.S. as the legitimate option during global crises. They're shaping international opinion long before a single physical shot is even fired. Which brings us to Part 4, the soft power machine and influence by design. This right here is the third major pillar of U.S. reach. We're talking about a vast network of NGOs, think tanks, and agencies operating under humanitarian banners to secure highly strategic geopolitical goals. Take USAID as a flagship example. Yes, it absolutely builds schools and supports civil society, but as journalist Matt Kinnard points out in his book Racket, this aid almost never comes for free. In practice, foreign aid buys a ton of goodwill, but the recipient governments are generally expected to open their markets to U.S. companies, back Washington at the UN, and just generally align with broader U.S. policies. It's a very subtle, highly effective form of influence by design.
Zero. Yep, zero. That is the exact number of comparable, globally sprawling soft power NGOs that Vladimir Putin possesses. He has no real equivalent to USAID. And because he lacks that institutional soft power, Russia constantly has to rely on much narrower, much cruder tools to project influence abroad. We're talking cyber attacks, targeted assassinations, or deploying mercenary groups like Wagner to places like Africa and the Middle East. It is highly disruptive, for sure, but it doesn't build any long-term structural alignment.
Finally, part 5, structural versus absolute power, the final contrast. To really bring this all together, we've got to look at the term the deep state. But hold on, we need to define it exactly, as former congressional aide Mike Lofgren does. He says it is not a shadowy, secretive cabal. Rather, it's a hybrid network of entrenched corporate, financial, and security interests operating on its own compass heading. By combining these intertwined networks, U.S. financial, media, and soft power create an incredibly unique global reach. This is the invisible string of American power. It's an establishment that remains structurally intact and highly powerful, completely regardless of who happens to be sitting in the Oval Office.
So when we actually contrast the power of the men sitting in those respective offices, it kind of looks like this. An American president might preside over the most powerful global state, but he is constantly hemmed in, right? Hemmed in by Congress, the courts, rival elites, and an independent media that he just cannot muzzle. Putin, on the other hand, he essentially embodies the establishment. He doesn't have to cajole competing power centers. He can literally annex territory or shut off gas pipelines to Europe without ever having to ask for a parliamentary debate. As this quote perfectly summarizes, Russian politics operates on a vertical of power. Basically, all levers eventually pull back to Putin. His control at home is absolute. I mean, he's shaped the constitution to potentially remain in power until 2036, and he can silence domestic dissent with an iron fist. So while his global reach might be structurally weaker and way less diverse than America's, his grip on his own nation's direction is fundamentally unchecked. And honestly, that leaves us with a truly fascinating paradox about the mechanics of modern power. We've seen how U.S. financial, media, and soft power networks create a globally dominant, uniquely integrated, and essentially untouchable system, even if the president himself is constrained. And we've also seen how a leader like Putin wields absolute, unfiltered control over his own nation's destiny, even without those massive global levers. So I'll leave you with this to think about. In the long run, which of these architectures is actually more formidable? A leader with absolute domestic control, or a leader backed by an untouchable global system? Think on that, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.